Well, our Torah portion for this Shabbat is the second portion in the fifth and final book of the five books of Moses, the book of Deuteronomy. We name Torah portions by the first non-repetitive word. So if a portion begins by Yomer Adonai, this happens over and over and over again in the Bible, so we wouldn't name the Torah portion by Yomer. The first word in this portion is Va'etchanan, which means I pleaded with God. And what's fascinating about this opening is that we see once again Moses yearning for the land of Israel. Let me read the translation of the first verse or so. I pleaded with the Lord at that time, saying, O Lord God, you who let your servants see the first works of your greatness and your mighty hand, you whose powerful deeds no God in heaven or on earth can equal, let me, I pray, cross over and see the good land on the other side of the Jordan, that good hill country and the Lebanon. If you've followed the narrative of the five books of Moses, you know that the land of Israel was on Moses' mind from the very beginning. Just as for Abraham, when God called him, the land of Israel was on Abraham's mind. And so in chapter 3 of Exodus, we read, just after God had called Moses to be the leader, and the Lord said, I have marked well the plight of my people in Egypt and have heeded their outcry because of their taskmasters. Yes, I am mindful of their sufferings. I have come down to rescue them from the Egyptians and to bring them out of that land to a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey. And Moses will lead them. In this first word by God to Moses when he calls him to be the leader, the land of Israel is on Moses' mind. But then we come later to the very powerful and problematic story of why it is that Moses, for all his aspiration and effort, does not get into the land of Israel. And here's what God said after Moses did something problematic. Just exactly what that was has puzzled translators, commentators, poets from time immemorial. Because God said to Moses, you did not trust me enough to affirm my sanctity in the sight of the Israelite people. Therefore, you shall not lead this congregation into the land that I have given them. But even though that decree was absolute, Moses does not give up. Once again, our Torah portion begins with another plea to be able to do that. O Lord God, you who let your servants see the first works of your greatness and your mighty hand, let me, I pray, cross over and see the good land. To which God responds, Ravlach, enough already. Don't talk to me about this again. And so I want to pose the following question. Why does Moses want so badly to be the one, not just to lead them through the 40 years trek in the wilderness, to lead them into the land of Israel? And I surmise it's because Moses wants two things. The first being the condition for the second. He wants to bring them into the promised land, their own land, where they can lead an autonomous communal life. And this is the goal that he has been searching for now 40 years. But there is a second reason, I feel, that Moses wants to lead the people in. Because he not only wants them to reach the promised land, he wants them to bring to realization the promise of the promised land. Arriving is a necessary condition, but not a sufficient condition for bringing to fruition the promise of the promised land. That is, he wants to bring them to a land not only flowing with physical milk and honey, but the milk and honey of a good, orderly, productive, purposeful, and moral society. And how do we know this is what Moses wants? Because the rest of the book of Deuteronomy, which takes the form of Moses' farewell address, his farewell sermon to the people on the brink of crossing over. In this farewell address, Moses tells them what kind of society he wants them to live, whence they cross over. And so let me illustrate this with a couple of passages. Moses says in the 4th chapter of Deuteronomy, "The Lord commanded me to impart to you laws and rules for you to observe in the land that you are about to cross over and to occupy." Or in chapter 6, "The Lord freed us from Egypt that he might take us and give us the land that he had promised on oath to our ancestors. The Lord commanded us to observe all these laws, to revere the Lord our God for our lasting good and for our survival, as is now the case. It will be therefore to our merit before the Lord our God to observe faithfully this whole Torah as God has commanded us." And much of Deuteronomy is devoted to these laws and values, which form the outlines as well as the substance of that good society. What do we see in these laws? Well, we see many things, many aspects of the society that will soon be in formation. But especially, it seems to me, what we see is a certain broad-minded humanism, typified by two kinds of concerns: substance and process. Substance, concern for the dignity of the stranger, the admonition to love one's neighbor, to care for and protect the weak, the poor, the vulnerable, the widow, the orphan, the stranger, those who are on the lowest rung of the social and economic ladder. For, and I quote now, "Remember that you were a slave in Egypt, and how the Lord your God redeemed you from there. Therefore I enjoin you to observe this commandment." And just how are these values to be pursued and safeguarded? Through an innovation in the book of Deuteronomy, the creation of a unique set of leadership roles, which features, I want to suggest to you, a system of checks and balances. The book of Deuteronomy is concerned with the limitations of power as well as its articulation. Beginning in chapter 16 of Deuteronomy, the author describes 4 different roles. There are prophets, there are priests, there are judges. Let me read you a description of the role of the judges. "You shall appoint magistrates and officials for your tribes and all the settlements that the Lord your God is giving you, and they shall govern the people with due justice." Govern the people with due justice. This judiciary seeks, first and foremost, justice in its many manifestations. First, to punish violations, and second, to protect rights. If human beings have dignity, one of the elements of that dignity is the possession of rights. And as we know, rights imply obligations. If I have a right, you have an obligation. And the fourth role is none other than the monarch, the king. We might think that the Torah is going to describe all the things that the king is called upon to do. But in fact, in Deuteronomy, the author tells us not what the king is going to do. It tells us what the king cannot do. And essentially, the king cannot be self-aggrandizing. The king is playing a role, and that role is not a reflexive one, to bring all the benefits of his reign back to himself. There is only one positive thing that the king is enjoined to do, and you will be surprised to hear what it is: to spend his days and his nights reading the Torah, so that he comes to see and internalize the values of the society which he is charged to protect. This is the society that Moses wanted, and why he so badly wanted to get into the promised land. And now I want to ask another question. What has happened to Moses' vision of a broad-minded humanism, of laws that protect the vulnerable, of the checks and balances that serve as the foundation of biblical humanism? What, to be more specific, is happening now in the land of Israel? As you know, the Knesset has just this week voted to approve legislation that will significantly limit, that is, weaken, the power of the judiciary. And it is the courts, after all, that are called upon to guarantee that human, civil, women's, and minority rights are respected, and that parliamentary majorities can't simply do what they please. Moreover, this move has significantly damaged Israeli society. And I quote an essay by Yossi Libna Klein in this morning's Times of Israel. The greatest danger to the startup nation, that's Israel, is an emigration of despair. In fact, that exit has already quietly begun. And if the government continues to fundamentally transform Israel in its image, an alliance of ultra-nationalists, religious fundamentalists, and the merely corrupt, we will experience our first ideologically motivated mass flight among those who connect this country to the global economy and the democratic world, end quote. And let's consider the power and the moral force of the vast protest that we have been seeing. A quote again: over and over, protesters tell interviewers variation of the same story. I'm doing this for my father, who was wounded in the Yom Kippur War. I'm doing this for my son, who was killed in Lebanon. I'm doing this for my grandparents, who were uprooted from Iraq and who survived the Holocaust. I'm doing it for my great-grandparents, who helped build the state. Now they say, it's my turn to defend our country. And just as on the one hand, the protest movement is trying to protect the Israeli success story, so this government, on the other hand, is actively seeking to destroy it. Each party within the coalition, here is tongue-in-cheek, has taken responsibility for undermining another aspect of modern Israel. The far-right zealots are ensuring that Israel becomes an outcast among the other democratic nations. The ultra-Orthodox state within the state is laying the ground for the eventual ruin of the Israeli economy, which is forced to maintain an ever-expanding, chronically underproductive population, which is the ultra-Orthodox Jews who want military exemptions and welfare, the settlers who want to be a law unto themselves, who abuse their temporal majority to secure exemptions, entitlements, immunities, and other privileges that mock the very idea of equality under the law. And here is a thoroughly corrupt Likud in charge of dismantling the independent judiciary, the last line of defense for Israeli democracy. Another strain, another author continues to say, on Israeli democracy is the half-century occupation of the Palestinian people. Given the inability to safely extricate ourselves from the territories, the occupation remains open-ended. The court is the only guarantor that the IDF will avoid the temptation of indiscriminate force in fighting terrorists embedded in a civilian population, precisely what the far right itself is demanding, and that democratic norms will be maintained on the sovereign side of Israel only if protected by the judiciary. Of course, the author goes on to say, and this is important to say, of course there are threats to Israel's existence. No country besides Israel has faced such a relentless assault on its existence. That situation demands constant mediation between security needs and democratic norms. Israel isn't a paragon of democracy because it cannot be. But Israel is a paragon of the struggle for democratic norms under near impossible circumstances, which would have long since ended democracy in almost any other nation. Israel is a laboratory for democracy under extremity. And that is its value for the world. Protecting that achievement requires a strong and independent court. In addition, this issue of whether the Supreme Court will maintain its role or be drastically reduced is widely seen as, and I quote, a proxy for a much broader battle over Israel's character. Will the Netanyahu government, the most nationalist and religiously conservative in Israeli history, be allowed to gradually turn Israel into a less pluralistic society? Will Israel remain a more secular and pluralist country, or will it become a more religious and nationalist country? The crisis in Israel is sometimes described as a battle between the left and the right, Ashkenazi Jews versus Mizrahi Jews. This is a vast overgeneralization. Netanyahu is a scion of the secular Ashkenazi elites, while many in the opposition are religiously observant and right-wing. What is true is that the new dividing line in Israel, as in so many other democracies, is no longer between liberals and conservatives. It is rather between liberals and illiberals. It's between those who believe that democracy encompasses a set of norms, values, and habits, that respect and enforce sharp limits on power, and those who will use their majorities to do whatever they please in the matter of politics, so that they may eventually do whatever they please in matters of law. And so in conclusion, it seems to me that we must ask the following questions. Did Moses yearn for the promised land in order to promote this kind of society? Did our ancestors for millennia pine for a return to the land Jews of all persuasions will be urged and invited to come? For a moment, when a radical and unrepresentative minority seeks to turn democracy into an autocracy and a fundamentally secular society into a theocracy, is this why Jews have yearned to return to the land of Israel for millennia? For a moment, when a group of radical legislators takes it upon themselves to run rampant over democratic norms and aspirations? What would the Moses of our Torah portion, of our tradition, Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses our teacher, who pleads with God to let him complete his task, what would this Moses think of where we are now?